Boa noite. Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to the series, Brazil 200 Years of Independence, History, Language, and Culture. Topic this week is Feijoada, and I call it Feijoada, the Brazilian national dish. You will see soon why I call it the Brazilian national dish, okay? So I am Mark Schaumloeffel. I teach Portuguese at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. This series is offered to you by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Community College, Language Center of the Barbados Community College. So, welcome back. Uh, so today, I was supposed to have another presentation that got canceled last minute yesterday. So I'm actually kind of improvising a little bit today. And what is also called a presentation is not really a presentation, but more a talk and a conversation about Feijoada. And the first thing I would like to do is asking you in the public, do you know what Feijoada is? Did you ever have a Feijoada?
It's a black bean stew with meat in it, pork, and bits
Yes,
of beef.
correct, Taylor. Did you ever have it? Did you ever try it?
No, I did it.
Okay. And any idea why this is the national dish of Brazil? No? Okay. So tonight I will explain a few things to you. And one of the things I'm actually using here to explain to you is uh, I use this base for my presentation today, an article by Rodrigo Elias. It's called Feijoada, A Short History of an Edible Institution. Okay. And he explains a little bit about what Feijoada is, but obviously I will tell you also from my own experience as a Brazilian, because as a Brazilian, there is no way you can come around a feijoada, right? So for me, feijoada, it is the national dish, okay? And there is a whole tradition behind it. Let me tell you a little bit about that. First of all, feijoada, let me get here my word. Feijoada comes from the word feijão, and feijão means beans, okay? So feijoada is like a bean stew, okay? So that is the word for bean or feijão in Portuguese. So, what does feijoada represent to me as a Brazilian? For me, it is a dish that is a symbol for what Brazil is. And I will explain that to you why I think that. Okay. Uh, First of all, uh, let me tell you a little bit about what we do as Brazilians for feijoada. Feijoada used to be a heavy dish and still is a kind of heavy dish that was used by the enslaved Africans for energy to give them enough calories to work hard in the sugarcane fields, for example. Um, Feijoada is a dish, as you said, Kayla. It's black beans. It has meat in it. It has pork in it. So beef, pork, uh, quite a bit of fat as well. Uh, and it is usually eaten together with rice. Uh, Farofa, I will explain to you later what farofa is. I think I'll explain it in another presentation we had already, but I will go a bit more into that today. And slices of orange and some green kale. Uh, People actually say that that combination of the orange, the vitamin C, the rice, the beans, the meat, and everything is a perfect combination for you to absorb all nutrients, all vitamins, because the vitamin C helps you to absorb the iron that is in the beans and all that. And actually, academics have studied the dish feijoada, and they say this is a complete meal. It has pretty much everything you need for a balanced nutrition, and for you to eat. It's a good thing. So as I said, in the past, feijoada was a dish that was used for people that were enslaved or others that would work hard on the field to have enough calories. And today, feijoada it became a national institution, and it is a typical dish for us Brazilians for a Saturday lunch. Okay, and why for a Saturday lunch? Because it is quite heavy, and it's not something you would eat and then walk from the restaurant back to the office or something like that and work, because you need to digest feijoada. And digesting the feijoada requires some work, so to say, from your body. Okay, so and especially because we like our feijoada together with the national drink, which is caipirinha, so the white cachaça, which is similar to rum, with the limes and sugar. So after you had a good feijoada on Saturday for lunch, together with the caipirinha, perhaps, all what you want is a rest to digest all that feast you just had. And so it became a typical Saturday lunch thing, or perhaps even on Sundays. And feijoada is something very social. You hardly go and eat a feijoada alone, or you hardly prepare a feijoada just for you at home. It is something to share with people, because feijoada is usually done in a big pot. Okay? And more or less compared to Barbados, obviously completely different. Brazilian feijoada is uh, your pudding and salt. Okay, so feijoada is this national institution, and why I'm saying this, it's because, well, I will come back to that later. I just saw that Marcia logged in. Marcia, can you hear me? Are you there? She's Brazilian Guyanese.
Yes, I can hear you, Marcus, loud and clear.
Very good. So tonight, Marcia, we are talking about feijoada. And as a Brazilian as you are, I would like to ask you, because we are having a conversation tonight, and I would like to ask you, what is your experience with feijoada? What can you tell people here about feijoada? How did you come across feijoada? When do you eat it? How does it work? What is your personal experience with feijoada? Can you tell us that? Can you share that with us?
Okay, well, I love feijoada. And well, my sister-in-law, she cooks it, so I know it having the calabresa, the black beans, they call it the feijão, and it would have in spinach. We call it couve. I don't know. I think it's the same spinach. And
Kale,
what
it's
else?
kale.
Yeah, the pigtail and whatever. But I love it. It's delicious, and I love to eat it with my farofa. And in Manaus, where I used to live, we always have it every weekend. So it's like every Saturday is the day for feijoada in the yard and the music and the bears, and it was like it is a delicious meal. I love it. That's my experience. And my mouth is actually running water. I want it right now.
So, as you all see, Marcia is confirming what I just explained, and this is not uh, made up. Okay, I didn't tell her to come in later and confirm what I was saying. So, as I said to you, she confirms that feijoada is a dish that today is eaten on a Saturday, usually for lunch and together with other people. So you socialize, you eat feijoada, you share it with your family, or you go to a restaurant and have it together with some friends. That is what feijoada is about. And Marcia was talking about, she mentioned calabresa, that you may not know what that is. And since we are here uh, flexible, calabresa is actually means Calabrian, okay? But it is a typical Brazilian sausage that is like made based on an Italian style of the Calabrian from the area of Calabria in Italy. And this is a typical sausage, Calabresa sausage that we put in the feijoada. Okay, that is what she mentioned here. That is the Calabresa sausage, right? So now I was telling you that feijoada. Very good, thank you, Marcia, for your contribution. You are confirming what I just said here earlier. Um, So, and now, why do I think that feijoada is something that is like the symbol of Brazil in a dish? Because feijoada is the combination of black beans, it is the combination of the meats, and it is a combination of cultures, okay? And why is it a combination of cultures? Black beans were available, or they are originally from South America, okay? And the Amerindians, they used to cook those black beans. And the Portuguese, when they colonized Brazil, they learned that those beans were edible, they could cook them, and learned to eat them as well. So the Amerindians play a role here in the coming together of a typical Brazilian feijoada. Also because the black beans are typically South American and typically Brazilian, so they don't come from Asia or from Africa or somewhere, okay? Originally though, feijoada is a dish that comes out of Portugal. It is a kind of the same as the French have the cassoulet, right? You may know cassoulet, which is this bean stew. The Portuguese have their own cassoulet that they call feijoada. And but feijoada in Portugal is different from feijoada in Brazil. Feijoada in Portugal is usually white beans. For example, I have here to show you what a typical feijoada transmontana, for example, looks like in Portugal. So this would be a typical one. They add some sometimes some legumes apart from white beans. Somebody joining here, okay. So apart from white beans, they also add their sausages. They add their pork. But you can also see what looks like here, like some carrots or some potatoes, which was not typical for our feijoada. So originally, the feijoada is Portuguese. Now, the feijoada, most people think, like Brazilian music, samba, that it is only African. It's not, but it has a heavy African influence in Brazil. And why? It goes back to history and also to a sad part of history. In our feijoada, like you in your pudding and sauce, we like, today it's a bit different, okay? But we have like more noble parts of the pig. But originally, and a typical traditional feijoada has salted pork ears in it, pork tail, smoked pork meat, and so on. And this tradition comes from the time where the colonizers enslaved the Africans. They would slaughter a pig and they would eat, let's call it the noble parts of the pig, the loins, whatever, the meats. And they would throw or give to the slaves the leftovers of a pig. And the leftovers were the things they didn't want to eat, which were the tail, the snout, the feet, the ears, and things like that. Now, being plenty available in Brazil, the black beans, the slaves cooked a stew out of it. And that is how they created a typical Brazilian feijoada, using like the basis from Portugal of how to cook a cassoulet or a feijoada, using the black beans from the Amerindians and typically from South America, and using their cooking habits out of Africa, and putting that all together. And so for me, a feijoada is a beautiful symbol that represents Brazil in a very authentic way because it brings together exactly those elements. The elements of the original, so to say, land of Brazil, the elements of the colonizer from Portugal, and the elements of the African enslaved people that were brought in, and their culture and their cooking habits that were brought in from Africa, mainly from West Africa, but from all over Africa. And all that is put together really in a stew, in a pot. And those cultures come together, those food habits come together, those uh, food elements come together to form a typical feijoada. So there is nothing more Brazilian than a feijoada. because you have all those elements of what make up Brazil you have in a pot. Okay? So this is why I believe feijoada is a perfect culinary symbol of what Brazil is. Okay. Now, you can always ask questions, okay? Because we are here in a conversation. I'm not doing a formal presentation with a PowerPoint and all that, okay? So now I would like to show you how a feijoada is done, a little bit of the history of it, and a little bit what is around it as well. And also what comprises a feijoada, because feijoada is not just, as I told you at the beginning, not just the black bean stew. It's much more to it. Okay. So let's watch the first video that explains the short one. Later we'll have a longer one that explains and mixes of the history. Okay. So let's have a look at the first video that explains feijoada. Can you just, as soon as I start playing, confirm that the audio is good, that you're hearing the audio?
Any discussion of Brazil's iconic dish.
Can you hear the video?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, yes, you can hear it.
Okay, I will just turn off my mic.
Any discussion of Brazil's iconic dishes is incomplete without an in-depth look at the country's national dish, Feijoada completa. Originating in Bahia, feijoada is now found in every corner of the Brazilian Republic. It is more than just a bean stew. It is a cultural rite of passage. Cariocas, Paulistas, Mineiras, and Bianos will all tell you their version is the best. Opting for a taste of Carioca-style feijoada, we travel to Ipanema to pay a visit to a true Rio classic, Casa da Feijoada. We arrived on a Saturday, the day feijoada is traditionally eaten, to a packed restaurant where chef-owner Gilberto Araújo receives us with chilled cocktails called batidas, containing a potent blend of passion fruit, lime juice, sugar, and cachaça. A proper aperitif for the restaurant's world-famous feijoada completa. Many legends mistakenly attribute feijoada to the slave kitchen. But the Portuguese consumed feijoada before they ever colonized Brazil, says Araújo. Regardless of the dish's origin, the Brazilian pantry has left its mark, with essential accompaniments like fried manioc root and farofa. Feijoada completa served with 11 different types of smoked or cured pork meats, sausages, and carne de sol. Every imaginable part of the pig is fair game in a traditional feijoada, but the trotters are essential as they thicken the stew with their natural gelatins. Slowly simmered for 5 to 6 hours, the ingredients produce rich flavors that are perfectly paired with side dishes like garlic sautéed kale, fried manioc root, crisp pork cracklings known as torresmo, Brazilian white rice, preserved malagueta peppers, and orange slices. The feijoada completa takes up every square inch of the table and is served family style. We are taught how to assemble the ingredients on the plate. A layer of rice lays the foundation for a generous helping of the rich black bean stew. Then farofa, toasted manioc flour, is sprinkled over the beans, and the remaining couve, fried manioc, pork cracklings, meats, and orange slices are arranged on the plate. This is feijoada completa.
Okay, I'm turning on my microphone again. Perhaps if you did observe not just the video, but also looked at my camera, I disappeared while this video was playing. because I had an idea. We saw the video here, and Marcia told about what she called
Any discussion of Brazil's feijoada,
what she said is a kind of spinach kale, right? Actually, I went to the garden and I collected the leaf, and this is the leaf. Let me see, how do I get it closer to the camera? Here. So this is the leaf. This is a couve leaf, a kale leaf that I just collected from the garden. So I have my Brazilian kale here that I use for my bean stews, and for this can be used in soups and anything. So you know kale, but this is what we call the butter kale. So it's a typical Brazilian butter kale. Okay, so I collected this from the garden while the video was playing. Yes, Len.
Yes, I've enjoyed feijoada in Brazil. My wife and I, we got married in Brazil, so we had a tour of the country, mostly Rio and Bahia, and it was amazing. It's a lovely dish, and it fit so well to my palate here in the Caribbean, because we're accustomed making the most of all of those same cuts of meat. I mean, it's a source of protein. A source of protein is a source of protein. It's just that some people, according to the society, some people got certain cuts and other people got what was left back. But it's good that the society has a concept of not wasting anything, wasting any part of it, and that the protein sources were very well used. And it's very delicious. Brazilian food altogether is very well spiced, very well seasoned, and it's very tasty. Thank you.
Yes, so you are very, very correct in saying that. And actually, in times when we talk about being ecologically correct and all that, not wasting any animal protein is very important, because we know that raising animals causes also some damage to the planet, contributes to the warming of the planet and all that. So wasting parts of animals is actually, so to say, I consider it a sin. And it doesn't make sense, because this is good protein. Like, as they said, you get the collagen out of the trotters, for example, right? Which is very healthy also as well. So it's good food and it's healthy. It's just that we established that certain cuts so are more noble than others. But as we say in southern Brazil, they get cuts of the cow. They say, oh, this is a prime cut, this is a secondary cut, this is a third cut. We say there is no such thing as a meat that is worse than the other. It's just another way of preparing it correctly to make it a good dish, right? And that's the same here, right? So we should make better use and reduce food waste all over the world, especially in the richer countries where a lot of is wasted without any need to waste it. Okay, very good. Thanks for your contributions. Now, I would like to go into something that is a bit more historical. It also shows how feijoada is prepared, including this couve leaf here, right? That will make a delicious part of the dish. And I'd like to show you the following video now. Once again, let me turn.
Oi, benvindo to Tasting History. Today we are going to be celebrating the 200th anniversary of Brazilian independence by making feijoada, their national dish, using a recipe from 1928. So thank you to my Patreon patrons for continuing to support this channel as we dive into the controversial origins of feijoada, this time on Tasting History. So before we actually get to the feijoada, I wanted to give you some context, the story behind why I decided to make this right now. And that is because next week, on September 7th, 2022, Brazil will be celebrating their bicentennial. Now, obviously, the story of how a country became independent is long and convoluted and very complex, but Here's a really short breakdown. What happened was in 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, doing his Napoleon Bonaparte thing, invaded Portugal. So the royal family, led by Prince Regent João of Braganza, hightailed it to their colony of Brazil, which, for all intents and purposes, became the new capital of the Portuguese Empire, even being elevated to the status of kingdom in 1815. And shortly after that, the Prince Regent became King João VI. And everything was hunky-dory until 1821, when the king had to head back to Portugal to put down a little revolution that was going on. And with him went the courts and most of the government, but he did leave behind his 22-year-old son, Dom Pedro, to hold down the fort while he was gone. Well, now with the government and the courts back in Portugal, it didn't take them long to be like, hey, Brazil, you're going to actually go back to being a colony and lose all of the privileges that you had. And they called Dom Pedro back to Portugal as well. He wasn't needed there anymore. And he was like, I don't think so. Or more politely, since it is for the good of all and the general happiness of the nation, I am willing. Tell the people that I shall stay. This took place on January 9th, 1822, and became known as Dia do Fico, or I Shall Stay Day. This kicked off a war for independence, and 9 months later, on September 7th, 1822, while on the banks of the Ipiranga River, Prince Pedro declared Brazil independent, with a cry of independence or death. And shortly afterward, he was crowned as Pedro I, Emperor of Brazil. And if the writings from the time are to be believed, it is very possible that he actually enjoyed a bowl of feijoada at his coronation dinner. Now this dish can vary from family to family and region to region, and really kind of depends on what food is available at the time. But overall, the dish hasn't seemed to have changed all that much in the last couple centuries. So what he might have eaten in 1822 is probably very similar to this recipe from 1928. In Manuel Quirino's A Arte Culinaria na Bahia. It is essential that the beans used be fresh so that the feijoada turns out delicious, with preference for the mulatinho variety, although others prefer the black bean. Separate any grains and debris from the beans and any beans damaged by the weevils or woodworms, and finally wash beans in cold water. While this is done, scald the dried beef on the fire and wash it of any impurities with water. The beans, dried beef, green meat or stew meat, and bacon are put to boil, then add sausage, salted pork that's been washed to remove the salt, chopped onion, black pepper, tomato and garlic, and a little vinegar. Along with that, add 1 or half a bay leaf depending on the amount of feijoada. To make it tastier, add Portuguese sausage and add some of the grease from the sausage. It's not all that different from the modern version, though black beans do seem to be the preferred bean in most of Brazil today, though the mulatinho is still eaten in some regions. Also, he says to use fresh beans, and if you can find fresh beans, great, but frankly, if you don't live next to a bean farm, I don't think that's going to be very easy, so I'm using dried beans, and you probably should too. Now, another term that popped up that I was rather confused about was the term carne verde, or green meat. And I was like, green meat, what is that? So maybe I thought like spoiled meat, but it turns out that green here is used to mean new or fresh, like if you were green on a job or something like that. So it's fresh meat. And it seems that fresh meat was not all that common in the 19th and early 20th century, partly because the heat and humidity of that area doesn't really lend itself to keeping fresh meat fresh for very long if you don't have any kind of refrigeration. Luckily, I do have refrigeration, so I will be using fresh meat or green meat for my feijoada. So for this recipe, what you'll need is around 2 pounds or 5 cups of dried black beans, 1 pound or 450 grams of carne seca. So this term is actually often translated as beef jerky, and I don't love that translation, at least here in the United States, because if we say beef jerky, we mean something thin and dry that you open the bag and then you eat. That is not what this is. It's not cooked. It is dry aged and highly salted, but you need to cook this meat or you're not gonna feel well. A half pound or 225 grams of fresh stew meat, a half pound or 225 grams of bacon, a half pound or 225 grams of paio sausage, and 1 pound or 450 grams of Portuguese sausage known as linguiça, and about a half pound of salted pork, whatever cut you can find. 2 onions chopped, 1 teaspoon of black pepper, 2 tomatoes peeled and diced, 8 cloves of garlic crushed, 2 tablespoons of white wine vinegar, and 2 or 3 bay leaves. So first, soak the beans in cold water overnight. Now, if you forget to do this, it's no big deal. They're going to be just fine. They just take a bit longer to cook. However, you do need to remember to soak the dried meat and salt pork. At least 12 hours, preferably 24, switching out the water every couple of hours. The more, the better. I cannot tell you how salty this meat is, so you have to get as much salt as you possibly can because it's going to be a really, really salty dish if you don't. Once the dried meat has soaked, add it to a pot of boiling water and scald for 20 minutes. And while you do this, you can cut all of the other meat into little pieces, including the sausage. The one thing that you might have trouble cutting up is the dried meat. It's really, really tough, so put that in some big chunks, let it cook, and then at the very end, take it out and cut that up. Now, once the meat is scalded, find the biggest pot that you have in your house, add the beans and about a gallon of water. Then add the bay leaves, carne seca, stew meat, and the bacon to the beans and mix together. Then set it over medium heat and bring to a simmer. Also, you might be tempted to cut all of the fat off of the carne seca or the dried meat. It can have a lot of fat on it, but leave most of it on because that is actually where a lot of the flavor is. You can remove it later. Some people actually put an orange half or two in there and it's supposed to soak up the grease. I just skimmed mine off because the orange does affect the flavor and our recipe does not use orange. Now let it simmer for about an hour, stirring every once in a while, and making sure that it doesn't really start to boil. The charm of this dish is the slow cooking process, and that's really where a lot of the flavor happens. So you just want a light simmer and let it go for a long time. Now when the hour is almost up, put a frying pan over a medium flame and add the sausage in to cook for just a few minutes until it starts to brown. And you may have to do this in batches if you have a lot of sausage. Now, besides browning it, what you're actually looking to do is get some of that grease out of there so you can then fry the onions. But first, take the cooked sausage, put it into the pot along with the salted pork, and then add the diced onions to the pan with the sausage grease. Let it cook for about a minute, then add in the garlic and cook until the onions start to brown. Then add everything from the pan into the pot. Finally, add the tomatoes, pepper, and the vinegar and stir. Then continue to let it simmer for another hour or even two. It's really all going to depend on how firm or soft you want the beans. Some people like them really, really mushy, but others like them a little bit more al dente. And that is preferred, especially if you have a lot and you're going to be reheating this over the next few days, because basically every time it gets reheated, they're going to get softer. And actually, the recipe that we're working from today says that if you suffer from stomach or liver issues, you can crush the beans and pass through a sieve to get rid of the bean skins. The same process should be done for serving older people. So if that's you, maybe get them nice and mushy. But regardless, definitely keep an eye on the pot as it's simmering because the water will start to go away and it can get a little bit dry. But worse than that, it can get really, really salty. The salt will concentrate. So you want to add a little bit of water when you need to. So yeah, and then just let it do its thing. And it's going to take a little while. So there's plenty of time to remind you to hit the like button. Make sure that you have pre-ordered the Tasting History Cookbook online. And I still have time to tell you about the history of feijoada. Feijoada gets its name from its main ingredient, feijão, or beans. Beans were a very important crop for the indigenous people of Brazil, and when Europeans first came to Brazil, they often wrote that the indigenous people would eat a lot of beans dusted with their actual staple crop, mandioca, also known as cassava or manioc. It would be made into a flour and dusted on top. This dish of beans and mandioca became popular with every group that came to Brazil, including the Portuguese colonists and the enslaved people they brought over from Africa. One French woman who was staying in Brazil in the 1850s wrote about seeing the African population eating this feijoada, and she actually uses that term, though that version of the dish seems to be quite different from the modern version, because she says that she sees black beans being cooked in a pot over 2 stones with a fire underneath, and then the beans were sprinkled with mandioca flour. Then kneading it all in their hands and forming large balls, they commenced to throw them in their mouth with much dexterity. If you wish to eat them with a spoon, they all persist that it takes away much of the flavor of their feijoada. So maybe we should be eating our feijoada with our hands, though the fact that they were able to eat it with their hands makes me think that the consistency was rather different than today's. But the point is that at this time, the enslaved people were making a form of feijoada. Now, she doesn't mention any meat, but she's just seeing it being made, so that doesn't mean that there wasn't meat in it at the time. But Isabel Burton also wrote about actually eating feijoada, and she also makes no mention of meat. The staple food of the people of the country, which takes the place of what the potato would be to the Irish, is a savory mess of small brown beans called feijão. A very coarse flour called farinha, which looks like a dish of shaved horseradish, is usually sprinkled over the beans. Then this is called a feijoada. It is delicious, and I should have been quite content to, and often did, dine on it. That farinha she mentions is the mandioca flour. Now, later descriptions, not long later, but later descriptions of the dish do start to definitely include meat, and it is almost always pork. In the 1850s, the English writer Thomas Ewbank wrote about his time in Brazil, which he alluringly titled A Journal of a Visit to the Land of the Coca and the Palm. The prominent feature in dietetics here is the enormous consumption of pork. It is used by the highest and the lowest, and used every day. And then what pork? It is all fat. And so with the Portuguese and Brazilians, a dinner without tozinho, bacon, is next to no dinner at all. Feijão com tozinho is the national dish of Brazil. And like he says, it was a dish for the highest and the lowest in society, and he's not the only one to have said that. In the 1880s, an Englishman traveling and staying with the cream of society in Brazil wrote another favorite dish is the feijoada, a stew of meat and black beans, which is also freely covered with farinha and made into a kind of thick mess, most unpleasant to look at, but excellent. A feijoada is one of the standing dishes at all the meals of His Majesty the Emperor. Though he does say that one time when he was in France, the Brazilian minister was throwing a big dinner, like a big state dinner with all Brazilian dishes, and the feijoada, which was on the menu, never came out. So when the minister went to ask the chef what happened, he said no power on earth would induce him to send up such a disgusting dish. How French. Now, while we know what feijoada turned into, it's very hard to pinpoint exactly when feijoada began, who the first people to make feijoada were, because partly we don't have a lot of written accounts except from the very, very top of society. I mean, everything that I've read pretty much has come from the very wealthy and privileged, so that's who they're writing about. They're not going to have a lot to say about the dining habits of the enslaved population or the indigenous population at the time. But as I was researching this dish, I found that every single article that I could find was really concerned with the question, who was the first group of people to make this dish? It really seems to be a bone of contention, and as I am not Brazilian and I've got no dog in this fight, I'm just going to tell you what I've read, and you can make up your own mind, or, like I did, I didn't make up my mind. So one theory is that it was first made by the early African slaves who came over and would make the dish using the scraps of meat that were left over from the kitchen. Though a lot of the articles state that those scraps of meat were things like salted pork ear and tail and tripe, but that's a rather modern conception that those would be scraps. Those are used in some very fancy dishes in the 18th and 19th century. So that reasoning doesn't really work out, but it doesn't mean that the theory doesn't work out. It's just more likely that they would have used that very fatty bacon that everyone seemed to have access to. Another theory is that it has its origins in Europe with dishes like the French cassoulet, beans and meat cooked together. The thing is, it's hard to make a definite connection there, seeing as every culture who has ever had access to beans and meat have put them together in a pot and cooked them. So it's hard to say that that is a definite descendant. I mean, is Western-style chili a descendant of cassoulet? I don't think so. Now, there are different feijoadas to be found in other former Portuguese colonies like Mozambique and Angola. But again, they're just meat and beans cooked together, and often the meat and the beans are different from the versions of feijoada in Brazil. So other than etymologically connected, it's hard to say that one really had to do with the other. If anything, I would actually put the origin of the dish with the indigenous people of Brazil, who were known to eat the beans with the mandioca flour, and most early accounts seem to say that that's all that the early feijoada was. Now, I'm not saying that any one of these theories is right or wrong, and most of the articles that I read usually came to the conclusion of, well, this might be how it went. And I think that that's kind of the best you can do, partly because that's just not really how food typically works. There's rarely one group of people who, or you know, at one time who create a dish, like fully formed, and that is when it was done. It's more of an evolution with different influences from all different cultures and practices putting into one dish. That's how most dishes evolve. And that's why I think it's so fitting that feijoada is the national dish of Brazil, because Brazil has so many different people from different cultures coming together, and they've all had their fingerprint on feijoada. It's kind of like that story about stone soup. Everybody puts their ingredient into the pot, except that there is no stone in feijoada, or at least if there is, you have done something very wrong. Though maybe you've just created a new variation on feijoada, and there are so many variations on this dish. Regionally, everywhere you go, they have their own little way of doing things. Often the differences come in what is served with the feijoada. There's a term called feijoada completa, which is kind of a whole meal around the feijoada. On the table was seen the traditional feijoada, dishes filled with mandioca, a large platter of rice, and 2 chickens, as well as bananas and oranges. This is about the usual Brazilian dinner to be found in the interior, where fresh meat is a rare thing. Now that was back in 1850, and today a lot of those things are still served with feijoada. There's actually a song from Chico Buarque about feijoada completa. It's called Feijoada Completa, and it's super catchy, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can listen to that while you make the rest of your feijoada. And here we are, feijoada from 1928. Delícia. And I made mine as a feijoada completa with a bit of rice, collard greens, orange slices, and of course, the mandioca flour, better known as farofa. So complex. So many flavors. It's definitely still salty. Not overbearingly so, but I think you want to make sure to kind of taste near the end and see if you need to add water or anything, because depending on what meat you're using, it can be really, really salty. Even after soaking it overnight and boiling it and everything, the meat is really salty, so you want to get as much out as you can. I actually really, really love that flour on top, because the flour adds this kind of crunch to it. It's almost like putting like breadcrumbs on top of a soup or a stew. It adds that, just some texture that isn't really soft. I'm going to have a little bit more because I want to try the sausage. The cool thing about this dish is that there are so many types of meat in it that each bite is going to be a little bit different, because you're not going to get all of the meats in one bite. So one time you'll have a piece of one sausage, and the next time it'll be bacon or salt pork. Really, really interesting. And with all of the accompaniments, I mean, this is a full meal. So whether or not you plan on celebrating the bicentennial of Brazil, I do suggest you try to find some feijoada. Either make it at home for yourself or go find it at a Brazilian restaurant if you don't want to do all the work and end up with a huge pot of feijoada. Not that that's a bad thing. So don't forget to like this video, follow me over on Twitter, Tasting History 1, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Ciao!
Okay, so much to the feijoada, the history of feijoada and his experience there. I actually, what he said is also a little bit in the spirit of what I said earlier, is that there is no single origin of feijoada. So if there is an origin for feijoada, the origin of feijoada is Brazil, where all those things came together. So the Amerindian element, the Portuguese element, the African element. So you cannot find all that in Portugal or all that in Africa or all that in Brazil. It's all those elements that came together form a feijoada, right? So that is why it is the typical Brazilian dish. Any comments? Any questions so far?
Hi, Marco. Paul here. Sorry, I'm
Hi.
late. I missed quite a bit of it. So it's beans with different types of meat, right?
Yes. Feijoada
And
is a black bean stew, and
mhm.
it has different cuts of meat in it. Yeah, and it has a history behind
Okay.
it. Uh, it is recorded. I explained it earlier, but it's basically
Okay.
it comes together like you have pudding and sauce here. You get leftovers from pig, and it is related to the history of enslavement in Brazil and to the origin of the black beans that are from South America. So it is like, for me, I described at the beginning as a symbol uh, or a symbolic dish for Brazil because it brings all those elements from history into one pot, right?
Okay. I was wondering. I'm not sure if anybody if it was like our pepper pot, but with beans. We have this thing. It's not Barbadian meat actually. I think pepper pot was originally made in Guyana. But
Yes,
we've adopted it, and it's all different types of meat. It doesn't necessarily have beans in it. It's just lots of meat done up in a stew, and you just keep on cooking it over and over. Okay, but I'll go back and watch the video and get a better
actually,
idea of
actually, what is interesting about the pepper pot is that it is fermented cassava juice that goes into it.
Mhm.
Uh, that is one of the main elements, and it also has an origin in the uh, Amazonian region. So that is something Guyana and Brazil have in common, and that is typically Amerindian. Uh, what is again the name of the black liquid they use in it? Somebody remembers now? The name doesn't come to my mind now. It's tucupi in
Cassoulet.
Portuguese.
Cassoulet.
Cassarip. So cassarip is actually the fermented of the wild cassava, fermented cassava juice that is used to season the meat. And Amerindians in the north of Brazil and in the south of Guyana, they do that.
So that gives credence to the fact that the origin is probably Amerindian rather than African. Okay, good stuff.
Yeah,
Well, Marco, no, it was something that you got to make for us one of these days. That's all I'm saying.
yeah. I make it sometimes. I can show you later. Uh, right now, I want to show you. We were also talking one of the important elements. I closed everything. One of the important elements of feijoada, let me get it open again, is farofa. And farofa is that, okay, I lost it now, but I will be able to get it back. Just let me open my, just give me a second. I'll stop presenting just to open something here. And the farofa is made of, here it is. Just a second. Okay, I found the video again. And it is, farofa is definitely something Amerindian, right? So, which is the roasted cassava flour. Let me share here with you again. And this is one of the important parts of a feijoada, is part of it. And this lady shows how farofa is made.
It's nutty, it's buttery, and it just tastes so good with rice and beans. It's so good. It really is. Hi, this is Bruna. Sorry. Hi. Whoa, hands. Hi, this is Bruna, and today we'll be making farofa together. Let me tell you a story. It's a love story. It takes place in Brazil, in the kitchen. Rice meets beans. Beans are soupy, and rice won't stick together. That's when farofa saves the day. Farofa is their cupid, bringing rice and beans together in perfect harmony, adding a crunchy texture
and a nutty, fatty flavor. This recipe will take about 30 minutes to prepare. Let's talk ingredients. We'll need 3/4 of a cup of butter, a medium onion, which we will slice into rings, and also 2 cups of cassava flour. So it's not very easy to find farinha, which is cassava flour, in your local supermarket. And that's why you're possibly going to find it online or at a local Latin American market. I want to give you specifically a brand here that really works for me. It's this brand, Julia, and I get it online. I try to find in my local grocery store, and unfortunately, I only found this brand. And by the way, this really does not work for farofa. Let's get started. All right, let's set the stove to medium heat. So you're gonna let the pot get really hot before you add the butter. Once the butter has melted, you're gonna add the onions. Okay, let's make sure that all of the onions are covered with butter before we let it rest for a minute. Every minute or so, keep checking. See how it's looking, if it's getting brown. Sometimes some onions are gonna get a little bit more brown than others. We're ready to add the cassava flour. Something that will make your farofa taste amazing will be making sure that you're mixing it up for about 10 minutes. You'll see that the color of the cassava.
Okay, so this mixing that happens here now, is my microphone on? Let's see. Yeah, it is. So this mixing that's happening now, this is what makes farofa very versatile. You can add onions, you can add bacon to this. People even add raisins, you can add banana, and while you roast the cassava flour until it becomes brown and crunchy. Okay, so this is where farofa get 1,000 different recipes, and everyone has their own recipe. But the base is you need some butter or lard, and you need the cassava flour, and you have to roast that. Okay, and whatever you add to it will add another layer of flavor to it. And this is typically a meridian. When in the video about history, the guy was talking about, they were describing something that didn't look like feijoada, but it is part of feijoada, where you can thicken up the beans and the bean stew using farofa or just cassava flour. We have something that is called feijão tropeiro, which literally is the troops that were going into Brazil. They would have like beans, they would have flour, they would have salt meat, and they would put together a dish. And sometimes feijão tropeiro can carry eggs, can carry sausages. And this is how a feijão tropeiro looks. It is like a dry feijoada that has the liquid of the feijoada is not there, but a lot of other ingredients are added to it. Okay. Obviously, it's not called feijoada, it's called feijão tropeiro. The beans for the troops, so to say. That is also a very traditional bean dish in Brazil. Our time is almost up. Does somebody have any comments, any questions? I'll stop sharing just to open something. Yes, if someone has a question, just ask it. I'm not seeing it right now, but you can just ask.
Hi, good night, everyone. Dr. Mark, I know we spoke a few weeks ago about getting the group together in person and perhaps having a Brazilian meal, and you come and tease us again with another lecture on Brazilian food. So I'm hoping that we can move towards that now.
Okay. We can talk about it. I found it here. Any other comments? Any other?
I support Charlotte's comment about the getting together for the meal.
Okay. If you know me personally, some of you do, you know that I like cooking, right? And my Instagram is basically about what I cook. So I do different dishes from different parts of the world, and I also cook Brazilian. And this here is obviously the cracklings, as you see here, that I cooked one day. We have that together with feijoada. This is actually one of the dishes like that has beans on its basis as well. If you go further down, I just saw, where was it? Here. So this is a typical feijoada dish that I would make at home. It's not feijoada completa, it's not a complete one, but you see here the rice, the farofa is there, and the bean stew is there with different kinds of meats, salt beef, rib pork, riblets, sausages, and so on. Okay, so this is a very typical thing for us Brazilians to do, and I have to agree, I'm getting hungry right now. Another thing we do that is also bean-based is like something we call caldinho de feijão, which is just the juice, so to say, of the soup, of the bean soup that we have. Like, this is a typical thing for a bar. When you go to a bar and have some beers or so, or at the end of the night, you have the caldinho de feijão, which is bean broth, literally translated, and like to prevent hangover and things like that. I also have somewhere a big pot of feijoada that I cook, but it's probably way far too down to be able to find it right now. Probably will not be able to find it. Anyway, other comments? Other questions? No, I won't be able to find it anyway. Oh, there it is. This is a big feijoada pot that I made. But this was good for a battalion. It was like the food for 20 people, together with rice and all that, right? Okay, so there we go. So I hope I was able to give you a glimpse on the typical Brazilian dish feijoada, on its history, and why I consider this a big symbol for Brazilian culinary arts and also for Brazilian history. So I hope you liked it. And I just was talking today with a Brazilian diplomat that is also helping us to organize this series. And I hope we can really meet at the end of this series. And who knows, perhaps cook something and try something Brazilian. Okay? So that's it from me. If nobody has any comment, any final comments? Nothing? If not, so that's it for me. So see you next week with another topic. So I hope to see you here again. Ciao, ciao. Good night. Boa noite.
Good night. Boa noite.
Boa noite. Com fome de novo, né?